Orthodox Rabbi David Rosen is the former Chief Rabbi of Ireland, is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs for the American Jewish Committee, and Director of the Heilbrunn Institute for International Interreligious Understanding. Rabbi Rosen has held more important positions of genuine relevance for the world than I could say here. And today, he talks about climate change as a pragmatic and religious issue of major concern on a cosmological scale. We start with David's self-introduction. You just won't want to miss this podcast. Take a listen.
This is a Religica production. Religica.
So my name is David Rosen. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. I was born in Britain, but after high school did my rabbinic studies in Jerusalem, where I was ordained. I also served as chaplain in West Sinai. So in Hebrew, Moses is referred to as Moshe Rabbeinu, which means Moses our rabbi, because a rabbi is a teacher, Moses our teacher. So I like to say that I was Moses' successor, because to the best of my knowledge, between Moses and me, there was no rabbi based in West Sinai. And now it's back with Egyptians, so I don't have much competition for the claim. And then I was rabbi in Cape Town, South Africa, from where I was expelled by the apartheid regime. And it's relevant to my journey. After that, I became Chief Rabbi of Ireland and returned back to Israel with my family in 1985. When I was in South Africa, out of a commitment to social justice, I looked for ways to be able to bring people together across the divisions that the government policy implemented. One of the ways you could do that without immediately running foul of the authorities was actually through religion. So I founded the Interfaith Forum, Council of Christians, Muslims and Jews there, which was quite successful in bringing communities together. So I came to interfaith relations out of a commitment to social justice. But that in itself was connected to my discovery of more issues of my environment in a broader sense. I was also on the ecclesiastical court in Cape Town, where we had to check up on the slaughterers to make sure meat was kosher. That immediately posed a problem for me. I wouldn't want to have done that, and therefore should I benefit from the actions that others are doing for me. I also became aware of the amount of cruelty in the livestock trade, with which I was really quite unaware. It seemed to me to be clear that the whole relationship of Jewish dietary laws involves your concern, your connection to the whole of the animal world. Simply because you slaughtered its next right and processed its meat by you disregarded your responsibilities from A to Y. That seemed to me to be rather wrong, if not hypocritical. There was also cancer in the family. I became much more aware of hormones and antibiotics contained within the meat, etc. And then I became aware of the environmental issues, and that the whole livestock trade and everything involved there does more damage to the environment than all the forms of transport in the world were put together. And it seemed to me to be the right environmental responsibility, as well as a question of distributive justice and your responsibility in light of the fact that there are millions of people dying and that we are consuming too much in that regard. And were we to cut down on our livestock consumption, that would make an enormous difference. So for all those reasons, I became vegetarian. I should have been vegan earlier, but it took me a while before I became vegan. And eventually I became president of something that's called the International Jewish Vegetarian and Ecological Society, which was established in England. But by now in the States, Jewish ecology, Jewish veganism has overtaken, but really at the time the British were the pioneers. So today I'm involved in a number of different environmental issues, ecological issues, through my interfaith work. I'm among the presidents of Religions for Peace, which has a focus on environmental issues. Quite a big one. There's a Commission of Ethics in Action, which is convened at the Vatican, of which I'm one of the religious leaders involved in that. And I'm also on the Religious Advisory Board of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that Jeffrey Sachs established together with others around the world. And I think that the environmental issue is the critical issue of our time. The question of climate change, the question of whether we have a home. In a sense, as I like to say, all other issues are moving the deck chairs around on the deck of the Titanic. Maybe even doing more than moving the deck chairs, but all of that is not going to mean any consequence if we come up against this iceberg. In other words, if we're going to face complete climatic catastrophe. So it's a pragmatic issue of why we've got to be involved in climate change, but that's also a religious issue, because religion is concerned with all those aspects I mentioned before, of, first of all, responsible stewardship of the cosmos. If you believe in a divine presence that has brought this cosmos into being, then you have a responsibility to it. If you disregard it or you degrade it, essentially you're disregarding, degrading the source behind that. So it should be obvious that this should be a religious issue. And then there are all the other aspects: health, compassion, attitudes towards animals. All these, I would say, are religious issues. Therefore, for me, it's the ultimate, all-time religious challenge of our generation.
As a person of faith, I mean, what can the faith communities do at this point in time, given the political and cultural environment? I mean, locally, at the national level, and international.
Well, I mean, I think the question is a question that's to be asked about all ethical issues in the face of the fact that there's violence in our world, there's conflict in our world, there are all kinds of bad things in our world. And I would say climate change deniers, even if their motives are not bad, are nevertheless doing bad things. And in all these respects, we've got to challenge them, and we have to do our best to grapple against them. Our first and foremost responsibility is within our own communities, to educate our own communities, to make them aware of the issues. And then you've got to be able to utilize the tools that are going to speak to them. So let me give you an example. Within the Jewish community, you can use questions like general environmental responsibility and even animal rights if you're talking within the Reform community. Mm-hmm. Within the Orthodox community, you've got to use other kinds of ideas. You've got to be able to show that, for example, through what's taking place in the livestock trade, animals' inner organs are being distorted to such a degree that they render the flesh non-kosher. That's going to be a much better tactic. Or you can deal with the questions of pollution in the environment, because there is, if you like, a jurisprudential, halachic corpus on those areas, but you've got to use the language that relates to their points of reference. Very often I talk about my interfaith work, and in fact I'm a translator, because even though I'm speaking the same language in the day, I'm relating to people according to different places, locations and codes, and I've got to be able to tune into them. So we have to find the ways to be able to explain to our communities, each according to their own understandings, what the challenges and the consequences of environmental degradation and pollution are. And we have to work harder at it than we're doing at the moment. And especially with the political environment, we have to work even harder. I personally am not, as I come across quite a lot of depression now visiting North America. I hope I'm not Pollyannish, but I'm not sure that it's totally justified. I think this is a one step back for two steps forward. I think, on the contrary, this will galvanize more intense activity in the future. In the meantime, it seems to me that actually, generally speaking, there is increasing awareness of the environmental issues amongst the population that I encounter. If you ask me why there's the denial, then I think it's obvious that people don't want to acknowledge that which they're going to have to pay for in one way or another. So just as they don't want to change their lifestyle, just as my preaching about veganism often falls on deaf ears, because it's very difficult to change if you haven't been used to it. And especially if you like within the Orthodox Jewish community, so much of rabbinical qualification and rabbinical, if you like, institutional control depends on dietary laws that relate to the meat industry. So you're actually threatening people's livelihood, their structures and securities. So this is not a simple matter. You've got to bear that in mind, obviously, in how you engage people in that regard. And when it comes to businesses, especially if they're in fossil fuel usage of one kind or another, directly or indirectly. So they don't see it as in their interest, because people are short-sighted creatures and don't look in the long term as to how it's going to affect their children, their grandchildren in the long term. They don't want to admit the consequences of it. It's much easier to live in denial than it is to face up to the questions. So we have to our best of our ability, treat these deniers with as much compassion as we can, to realize that it's fear and change that they are concerned about, and to help find ways to find alternative solutions that people can move their industries, activities and occupations in another direction.
So you've already touched on, I think, one of the things we really wanted to give you an opportunity to do. You've done a bit of a dive already, but maybe a deeper dive of just your own tradition and key virtues and lessons we should carry forward in terms of treating the planet.
Right. So the first and foremost, as I've already mentioned, but let me repeat again, is that if you believe in the power behind the universe and that the cosmos, the creation, is a manifestation of that presence, then you have first a responsibility towards that environment. And this is God's creation, just as our tradition teaches that you cannot love God if you do not love your fellow human being. I would say it's obviously you can't love God if you don't love your environment, because your environment comes from God, and therefore that's a manifestation of the divine in the world. So it's a divine imperative in and of itself. Then, of course, the Hebrew Bible teaches that the earth is the Lord's, and that's explicit, which means that we are only tenants and sojourners here. Nobody should look at themselves as having any kind of absolute ownership in any manner. And if you're a tenant, if you're vulnerable, you look at things in a different way than if you are all-powerful and control everything. So it's a very important perspective to be able to see our presence here as tenancy and having that responsible stewardship, as it's written in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, I think. First, human beings were put on the world in order to develop and protect it. That's sustainable development. You develop, but you're protecting it at the same time. And another very important principle in Jewish traditions from the book of Deuteronomy, which is the prohibition against cutting down fruit trees, even in context of battle. So you could say, defending myself, it justifies everything. But no, it doesn't justify everything. And this prohibition against destruction of fruit trees is extended within the rabbinic tradition already 2,000 years ago to mean any kind of wanton destruction, and therefore any kind of waste. And Jewish tradition has a very strong focus on this issue of not wasting. I was brought up that way. It wasn't just a matter of not leaving on your plate. You never, if you walked on the road and you saw a piece of bread on the floor, you had to pick it up because you had to show reverence to the fact that it was food and sustenance and coming from God. And of course, we say grace before meals, we say grace after meals. All these things are recognition and thank you and awareness of the gifts that we get from the divine, from the source of all. So the idea of not wasting is a really very important principle. The concept is known as bal tashchit. And shachat actually is from the word of corruption and is related to the concept of degradation. And therefore, any wastage is a form of degradation and a form of humiliation of the divine. So we need to live a modest life. It doesn't have to be a frugal life, but it mustn't be a grandiose or wasteful life. And so that's a very fundamental value as well within our tradition. There's another important principle, and that's the principle against doing any cruelty to animals. Compassion to animals is a fundamental Judaic teaching. It's true Judaism does allow for the possibility of eating of animals out of a recognition that one isn't always everywhere at every time able to get everything that one needs for the necessary nutrients in your body from plant sources. But it's clear that this is not an ideal, but a concession. The language that the Hebrew Bible uses for meat eating is im ta'avena shotechem l'chol basar. If your heart's lust to eat meat, then this is the way to do it. In other words, it's a concession. Just as the Bible, for example, mandates for divorce. Divorce isn't ideal, but it's a recognition that people don't always get on with one another, and therefore better to go their separate ways than to live in an unhappy situation. So the Bible mandates for many different situations which are not an ideal. But the ideal is the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are vegans. Even the Messianic age, where the lion and the lamb lie down with the wolf and the sheep, where the wolf and the sheep and the lion with the calf, all these, this is a vision, if you like, of a world where there's no destruction and no violence. In that sense, it resonates with Eastern concepts of ahimsa. So this is the ideal, and we have to move. And I would say, in fact, I'm not original. Great rabbis before me, Rabbi Kook, the first chief rabbi of the Jewish community in the Holy Land, and even sources from the Middle Ages like Rabbi Joseph Albo, author of the Ikarim, I think in the 14th century, maybe 15th century, all of them have pointed out that the real ideal is a plant-based lifestyle. If one can achieve that particular goal. Rabbi Kook even goes into details as to how the temple will be run, and the third temple, when it's built, and essentially with its plant-based gifts and things, etc., and going there. So at any rate, for me, it's obvious that this is the ideal. I recognize that not everybody is able to. There are various, as we said, pressures on people's lives, but people should be working in that direction, and one should be arguing for it. I find it difficult to understand great religious leaders who can issue statements about the environment and very important guidelines, but don't address the question of livestock consumption and treatment of livestock and what dietary lifestyle people should be taking. I can understand sometimes they come from very heavy meat-eating countries and it's difficult for them to do that, but in this day and age, I believe that a responsible religious leader should be advocating for a plant-based diet. And not least of all on its very important fundamental ramifications, because as we know, and I think I may have said, livestock trade causes more damage to our environment than all the forms of transport all put together.
I think we've done a masterful job here this afternoon of covering the issues, and just open it up to you one last time here if there's anything else you want me to ask a question about. Or
I hope I've exhausted the subject, but I probably
you
exhausted
have.
myself.
No, spot on. It's totally spot on. So great.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you.
You've been listening to Religica. Visit us at www.religica.org.